Hello, everybody. This is Craig from the Pacific War Channel, and this is Echoes of War. I'm joined here by my co-host, Gaurav. How are you?
Hey Craig, great to be on here and another exciting episode, I would say.
Yes, so we strategically made a great correction to an episode we did a long time ago when we were trying to cover the best generals, admirals of both theaters of World War II. It was way too cumbersome, and we ended up rushing through it. So we decided we were going to make a four-part series covering all of them. We already did land-based generals in the Pacific. We did generals for the land-based in Europe, and today we're going to be doing admirals from both theaters. And then the next episode is actually going to be the air commanders. It's a lot easier, and I think we can get it pretty well done in the time period we have. But before we jump into it, I just want to say if you want to further support the channel, please go check out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/the Pacific War Channel. Over there, you get access to the exclusive podcast. You get early access to all the content I make and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. And I'm going to just add one thing. Today, we're going to try something a little bit different. It really did come to me through a lot of community posts I did on the Pacific War Channel that the majority of people don't necessarily watch podcasts visually because this will be on YouTube. But for certain episodes, let's say the one we're doing, maybe you want to see the face of the Admiral. So we are going to really bootstrap things and use some functions in Zoom just to show pictures of each admiral as we talk about them. And in the future, when we're talking about certain battles, I think it would be pretty useful to put up a map because I can say there's been quite a few occasions where the audience must be confused out of their mind when I'm speaking about over 12 different provinces in China and you have no idea about your Chinese geography.
Or North Africa for that matter.
Yeah, North Africa is a great example. So yeah, I think this is probably going to be a mainstay in the future. This is the first time we're doing it, and we're going to have to juggle with each other's because, as you can imagine, we write notes and we have notes open on our Google Chrome tab, so we don't want to like just splash with everything that we have in the background because we'll look like idiots. But I desist. Gaurav, I guess you can hit the randomizer because we have four factions to talk about in this. What are we going to be doing first?
Yeah. So looks like we got a pretty heavy hitter, I would say, right from the start. So we are starting off with the Imperial Japanese Navy.
And ironically, I am Craig from the Pacific War Channel, so I guess I better know my stuff. This is actually the only one I didn't write notes for, by the way, ironically enough. But so we're going to be talking about who's the best and the worst for the admirals in the Imperial Japanese Navy. Again, as we've said in previous episodes, this is just our opinions, people. Clearly, there is no way really to gauge who was the worst, or I mean, you could, I guess, figure out who's the best general of the faction. But these are our opinions. Please don't come after us. Um, I don't think we're going to say anything too controversial, mind you, for most of these. But yeah, when thinking about who the best admiral would be for the Japanese, it's hard not to be cliche. I could have chose a lesser admiral like Mikawa, for example, and it might have been more pertinent because, you know, they see frontline action. But I think I just can't not choose Isoroku Yamamoto. There's many reasons as to why. I think on the other side of the coin, there's a certain other individual on the United States side that I wouldn't choose because he's in a similar situation where he's the overall commander. Basically, he's the face of the Pacific Fleet, and that doesn't mean that they do a lot of frontline action. But Isoroku Yamamoto needs to be put as the best because of innovation. He also is. I guess you could say a little different from some of the other admirals we see from the Japanese side. There were many admirals that did go to the United States and were educated in the United States, but I think Isoroku Yamamoto is the most profound. He studied at Harvard, for example, and he gained a lot of valuable insight into not just the academics in the United States, but he actually got to see American culture and American production. He got to visit some of the plants, like the Ford factory, for example, and he traveled a lot through the country. Unlike his counterpart, Hideki Tojo, who spent his whole time in America on a
Mm,
train and didn't even look at
The
anything.
only other man who kind of had the same level of insight was covered last week,
Yeah,
last time out, General Kuribayashi for the
yeah.
Imperial Japanese Army.
Very good comparison, by the way, of the two men. There is a dichotomy between them because they both believed it was an absolutely hopeless war. They could not defeat the United States, and they
It
didn't
had to
want.
be a quick, it had to be a quick war with their victories. Otherwise, they knew they lost the war.
Of course. But what is there to say about Admiral Yamamoto that people might not know? Of course, he at one point was the commander of the first Carrier Division, and later a chief of the Aeronautical Bureau. He championed the integration of air power into naval operations, which might not seem like a big thing, but back then, there was something called the Big Guns Club, which was the idea that battleships, capital ships as they would have been known, were the only thing of importance to a navy. The idea that carriers were going to be at the forefront was really not a thing. Um, what else to say about him? Overall, he championed the development of Japan's carrier fleets, including the construction of carriers like the Akagi and Kaga. He emphasized the use of carrier task forces, and something that sounds pretty obvious to us today, but something that would have been profound back then was he championed the concentration of naval air power. So, for example, his attack on Pearl Harbor. They concentrated the most air power that they possibly could, snuck it over, and attacked. This was pretty unheard of. This was not doctrine by any
It's
measure.
if I were to give like a land comparison, it's actually the original doctrine for the use of naval air power was the World War One use of the tanks, for
Yeah.
example, where they are moving piecemeal in support of various smaller detachments. And he's the guy that says, now let's concentrate. And we are talking about a force of six fleet carriers that come
Oh
together.
yeah. Strongest in the world at the time. But yeah, that's actually no, that's a perfect yeah, it's a perfect dichotomy because it's true. During World War One, the French and the British had basically no idea what they were doing with these land whales, as Churchill called them. And it wasn't until someone had actually come up with the idea of concentrating them and using them like a fist to break through an area, and they realized, wow, you can actually gain territory massively by using armor. And that's basically what Yamamoto did with aircraft carriers. On top of that, if you look at him as a commander, he wasn't just the moral backbone of the Imperial Japanese Navy. He was the morale backbone of the entire Japanese military for the time that he was in grace, because he did kind of fall out of grace at the end. He was also the strategic backbone of the entire Japanese military. It's not that he controlled everything, but basically by threatening to resign all the time, he kind of did. A lot of operations were simply because he would resign otherwise. Like Midway, for example, he put his foot down. As bad as it went for
Or
him.
or I should also point out this is exasperating the already tense situation that the Japanese army and Japanese navy were known to have in terms of like resource allocation and everything.
Yeah, of
But the
course.
guy was at his peak. I think the only person probably more revered in Japan would I would go as far as saying is the emperor
Yeah, no,
at
you're
his
definitely
peak.
right. Yeah. And I mean, we're talking about a Japan that was heavily still skewed by the army. The army, because Hideki Tojo, he was seizing power. Like he really, man, he was, God, he was a real rat. He managed to really seize a lot of power for the army. So it's impressive that Yamamoto even survived as long as he did, because there were assassins trying to come after him from the army. And another thing I think that's important about Yamamoto is he was very realistic about the war outcome. Um, he predicted he would probably give the Japanese about 6 months to run rapid. That's what happened. He kind of gave them the doctrine that would follow them through the rest of the war, search for the decisive naval battle, and try to make the Americans bleed so much that they'll come to the peace table. It maybe could have won, potentially that could have won them some territories in the end, but well, it didn't really pan out. And he
I, I
oversaw.
would just I would just add one thing though, and this is just probably an opinion of mine.
Mhm.
US, because of FDR's moves right from 1940,
Mhm.
when they started the rearmament, they were slowly gaining traction, but they had not started from zero when war was declared. So
Yeah.
the industrial gear of the United States had already been started to turn.
Hmm.
If probably that never took place and they just started from ground zero on 7th of December 1941, he might have had more time to prepare the defenses of the Japanese Empire.
Yeah, definitely. And the last thing I'll say is the thing that kind of gets overlooked is yes, he was the mastermind. You know, he's not the only mastermind behind Pearl Harbor, but he also oversaw the entire 6 month period for the naval operations. And I mean, this is the combined fleet aiding, with the capture of the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, engagements like we spoke about not too long ago, the Battle of the Java Sea and such. He oversaw one of the greatest expansions in military history. So that's why I would put him at the best.
You can't deny that pioneering.
Yeah,
That I always value innovation, and he definitely brought that. I think maybe, Craig, before we go to the worst, let's put our honorable mention.
sure.
So I'd really like to just put Admiral Ozawa as an honorable mention. So he really takes center stage for the Imperial Japanese Navy in the second half, you could call it towards the end of the war.
Mhm.
So after Midway, he's anyways promoted to command of the third Japanese fleet, which provides support and the withdrawal of the Aleutians. And we really see him in 1944, where he's given command of the first mobile striking fleet, which is supposed to be the last striking force of Japan. And he suffers quite a few defeats in the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf. But at that point, the guy's pretty much done the best he could with what he had. There's even the U.S. historians knew that. The U.S., for example, at the Philippine Sea, he chose the correct way to attack the United States Navy that was supporting the invasion of Saipan, if I'm not mistaken. I think that was where Philippine Sea was supported.
Yep.
And within that, he knew he had at least the range advantage. And he utilized that because otherwise, if it was in, say, complete combat effective range of the United States Navy, he's toast. Granted, he also suffered from horribly faulty intelligence of the Japanese Navy naval forces on ground. And I think his greatest success definitely was Leyte Gulf, where his northern striking force, as it is called, successfully baited Halsey and Mitscher's forces.
Definitely.
And that gave the opening for a near total disaster for the US Navy. But in that sense, the guy did his job bang on. The military record won't look good, but with the resources that he had and the odds he was up against, it's quite a very impressive thing what Admiral Ozawa did. So just wanted to put his name out there.
All right. And for Worst Admiral, I don't think anybody's going to be surprised. And I just want to say off the bat, I do not think he was a bad admiral, but I have to pick somebody, and I think it just made the most sense. He's also quite infamous. Of course, it's Admiral Nagumo, the man who many would claim lost the Battle of Midway. Although I think that's a little harsh. It's not that it wasn't completely his fault. We'll just say that. What to say
I
about
mean, if
him?
you want to put the fault, it's pretty much a lot of the Japanese senior command.
Including Yamamoto for that
Yeah,
matter.
exactly.
Yeah.
Because Yamamoto had this great idea of a clockwork mechanism battle.
Yep. But to add some nuance, instead of just talking about the Midway debacle, which everyone focuses on, let's look at Nagumo as a person. He graduated from the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy in 1908. A bit on the older side, mind you. He specialized specifically in torpedo warfare and, of course, surface operations. He rose through the ranks due to showing a good amount of skill and leadership. He would command various destroyers, cruisers, and battleships, gaining extensive experience in surface naval combat. He was a commandant of the torpedo school, and he refined Japan's focus on torpedo technology and tactics using torpedoes. So
Long
again,
plans.
yeah, you should notice there is nothing about aviation in there, and that's something to take a notice of. Um, as anyone would point out who knows a little bit about him, he is an extremely overly cautious commander. A lot of people point out that he missed the supposed third wave during Pearl Harbor, which absolutely was not a fault or an error. He made the right decision not launching a third wave. People who don't
It was
know so much,
just,
yeah,
yeah, I was just saying, it would just cause unnecessary casualties because by then the US have completely woken up.
yeah. I'm not going to name the person, but there is somebody that I brush shoulders with quite often, another YouTuber who likes to like comment on Twitter like that this was the pivotal moment the Japanese could have really done damage is if the third wave destroyed the oil tanks and all that. And I keep reminding this guy, the way that the oil tanks were made in Pearl Harbor, there was no way that a medium like a light Japanese dive bomber could do anything to them. Like they wouldn't light on fire, even if they managed to destroy one of these oil storage tanks. They weren't made in such a way that they would start like exploding the other ones. And the fire teams in Pearl Harbor are actually really good. They would have put it out. There was no
Yeah,
hope of taking out the oil, just to say, not go down the rabbit hole. But on top of that, like you
yeah.
mentioned, the casualties incurred on the second wave for the Japanese were getting pretty high. And if the Japanese launched a third wave, not only would the casualties be really bad, they might have a lot
There's
of
no
guys.
gain.
Yeah, the guys might have had to ditch at sea because they had to get out of there, and they had no idea where the American carriers were, and those carriers could have attacked them. Definitely was a possibility. I think if the American carriers came to attack them, it would have actually been bad for the Americans. So I think they would have lost two carriers. But needless to say,
Yeah. But
yeah.
I just add one thing. One of his fellow admirals and one of his friends, Admiral Shukahara,
Mhm.
he said he was also surprised that Nagumo got the job as the chief of the naval air arm of the
Yeah.
Japanese Navy. He says, his background, his training and experience and interest
Yep.
were all completely not suited for the role.
So
And
yeah.
And Admiral Yamamoto's preferred choice was actually Admiral Ozawa, who
Hmm.
knew the weapons quite well. Ozawa had training with naval aviation and experience.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, Nagumo only gets his job just on seniority basis. And let's also call it out that Nagumo and Yamamoto, they detest each other like probably
Yeah.
like, Yamashita and Tojo kind of hatred.
I wouldn't say it was that far, but they were opposites. Yamamoto
Yeah.
was very
Okay, fair enough.
bold. I wouldn't even call him aggressive. He was bold. He took the initiative. He understood how plans could move and shift, and he tried to think outside the box. Nagumo,
Like what?
the best way to describe him is he is a by the books officer. He takes commands from the top and he follows them. And whatever the pre-battle plan was is the only thing he goes by. He can't make decisions otherwise. I mean, of course he'll have to, but he really doesn't want to. He does
It's
not like to
he
take the initiative.
unless it's absolutely forced upon him, he's
Yeah.
not going to do it. It's mechanical. If he
Yeah.
really, I would call it a mechanical, nothing
Now,
else.
now Yamamoto very much understood how to use Nagumo. He's like, okay, whatever I tell this guy to do, this guy is going to do, no matter what. And that's could be of a benefit. That can also be terrible. Because if you can't trust a guy you're delegating, let's say, something that might be important, like the entire Kido Butai to, the guy can't think outside the box, well, it could go to disaster. And like you said, Nagumo, he was picked because of seniority. I mean, like, let's look at it, one of his counterparts, Fletcher. Again, Fletcher, a large part of why he's in the role he's in is seniority. And it's who you knew. Nagumo was probably liked by a lot of commanders, maybe in the army, by the way. And he was seen as a choice that could equalize Yamamoto because there were a lot of people who hated Yamamoto. So maybe making Nagumo the leader of, the Kidobutai, maybe that was kind of like a way to punch Yamamoto. I don't know. But unfortunately, Nagumo ends up being, the commander of the first air fleet, the Kidobutai, without much of a background in naval aviation. I guess he had to become a quick learner. And he oversees Pearl Harbor. And you know what? For the first 6 months, on paper, Nagumo is the most proficient commander of the Japanese Navy because he oversees
He,
all of these great things, you know?
the Ceylon raid, I think, was one of his
Yep.
biggest and not heavily talked about operations.
He had the bombing of Darwin and he had the Indian Ocean raid, like you just said. So he two amazing raids. And I mean, this is after Pearl Harbor. He sees all these other operations. He's running rampant. And up until the Battle of Midway, I think you would argue Nagumo is a solid A-list admiral and he can be depended upon. Unfortunately, during the Battle of Midway, even though he brought up the issue that might unfold, what if the Americans somehow get their carriers in and surprise them? Well, that ends up happening. Nagumo famously faces a dilemma, which is actually to this day called Nagumo's dilemma. And well, the Battle of Midway is in part lost because of this, but it was flawed from the very beginning. I think we would argue Nagumo's not responsible for the Japanese naval codes to be leaked, and decrypted, and the fact that they were walking into an ambush in the first place. But Nagumo is definitely guilty of not acting quickly enough, and had he believed in his reconnaissance maybe and not kind of dragged his foot a bit, things could have gone differently. But
I think I would just add the Japanese preparations for the operation because they had absolutely no idea that their codes were broken.
yeah,
Even the recon effort that he puts out by his supporting cruisers and aircraft before launching the strike on Midway Island is how do you expect 13 aircraft to look at hundreds of thousands of miles of ocean,
yeah, yeah.
square miles of ocean? It's half-hearted. It's just 13 aircraft.
And you know what? If I were to throw something else out there to defend Nagumo, Nagumo again, he's a by the books guy. Doctrine for the Japanese as well as the Americans. You have a proper air squadron formation, and it goes in and attacks. Was he to expect the Americans would all of a sudden absolutely batshit crazy throw piecemeals at them? No, he would not have expected this. Unfortunately, he should have. Once the reports started to come in, figured something was up, and I don't think he's completely at fault, but most people, if you're putting him on a list, they're going to say, yeah, it's Nagumo's dilemma. It's Midway. That's why he's the worst admiral. And you know
I think
what?
the only thing was just his lack of ability to take the initiative or think on his own, right?
Yeah, that,
As they say, your plan is your first casualty of war.
yeah. And much like one of his counterparts, Fletcher, he's disgraced from Midway, and then he's shuffled around, and he's not going to be seeing as prestigious commands anymore. And then he'll end up killing himself at the Battle of Saipan, which, yeah, that's the end of him and his career. And I guess that's why I would put him as the worst.
It's what I find really funny is you have the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, where actually both Fletcher and Nagumo pretty much lose their active naval commands after that.
Yeah. And stating that, are we now on to a different faction?
Yeah, that's got an honorable mention. I think we can go on and the rolling of the dice, and on my phone, that random generators come for the United States Navy.
Oh, so I'm back up. And we're going to start with the best. I just want to say off the bat, it's actually kind of impossible to pick a best because you have, of course, everyone's going to say, yeah, you got Halsey, you got Spruance, you got Nimitz. The only reason why I wouldn't put Nimitz at the forefront is, again, like Yamamoto, he's the entire fleet command. Like, I don't know if I would rather pick someone who does some frontline action in the war, per se. But I think definitely there can be a argument for Nimitz being here.
Uh, and just before we get into the details of the ones you selected,
Mhm.
I want to put an honorable mention because we just won't have time to go through so many great admirals.
Yeah.
Is I want to put a mention to amongst the best US admirals who unfortunately we will not be covering in this. Uh, Bull Halsey or Admiral William Halsey Jr.,
Mhm.
commander of the Third Fleet, and Admiral Charles Lockwood, the commander of the US submarine forces, and the guy who pretty much ensured that the US torpedoes would actually become a potent weapon of war.
Yeah, no, there's a lot. Unfortunately for the United States, there's just a lot of really good admirals. Like, it's hard to pick. And I ended up picking Spruance because I I personally like him to, it's hard. Between him and Halsey particularly. I think they're both interesting to compare and contrast, but I went with Spruance in the end. And I mean, for those who don't know, Spruance, his claim to fame would begin with the Battle of Midway. But let's take it to his character before that. He had graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy in 1906, and he had served on battleships and destroyers during the early years, developing an expertise in engineering and naval operations. He held various commands and staff roles, including commanding destroyers and serving as an instructor at the Naval War College. He had a nickname known as the Electric Brain because he was considered extremely calm under intense circumstances. And I think that's a very
That
big quality.
That is actually an amazing quality, you'd ask me.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think when you explain more, I think when I compare some three admirals, I think I'll just get that opinion of mine through.
Yeah, compare it to Nagumo, who famously, if you watch any of the movies that look into the Battle of Midway, he did not handle the stress well when it came to the the reconnaissance reports coming into him because he was surrounded by staff officers, and he probably should have like got out of the bridge for a second, took a breather, and he didn't. He didn't handle stress too well. But as for Spruance, he took command of Task Force 16 at Midway, and despite the fact that Fletcher had overall command, Fletcher kind of just allowed tactical command to go to others. So Spruance really did take a ton of initiative during the Battle of Midway. He launched his first strike without any delay, very decisively, knowing full well that Nagumo's aircraft were probably returning from Midway, so that they'd have to land on the carriers and refit. So he was really hoping to catch the carriers while they were loading aircraft, and this is what led him to send not full air squadrons, which is doctrine, but to just send as fast as
Just
possible
to pack it.
piecemeals. Yeah, he told his
Yeah.
pilots like try to assemble on the way, but go. And that's honestly, one could argue, super reckless. Really reckless.
But but that actually worked out so well in the course of the battle because it
Yeah.
delayed the recovery and preparations for the second strike that Nagumo had planned.
Yeah. And even books kind of acknowledge there is a bit of luck when it comes to Midway that all of this, like so many different groups of aircraft came at the same time when they hit the Kido Butai, and that really led to the Kido Butai's cap falling apart, and thus the carriers became vulnerable because
Hey,
anti
if we always comment about Julius Caesar's luck, Spruance also deserves it.
yeah, yeah, of course. Like there's a lot at play with Midway. Like Shattered Sword, very famous book that's just about Midway, minute by minute. It does a great job explaining like how insane of a battle it really was. But yeah, definitely Spruance, his entire claim to fame comes from Midway. It just completely explodes his career. He will be taking command of the Fifth Fleet, and while that same fleet is under command of Halsey, becomes the Third Fleet. So they're kind of like these two brothers during the Pacific. It's interesting.
I actually like the system though that this is a system that Admiral King pushed for, which was a big blue fleet. I think that is what it was called,
Yeah,
and it is designated Fifth Fleet with Spruance in command and uh, Third Fleet with Halsey, and they alternated command. So when Halsey is taking tactical command of the fleet for whatever operations he has, Spruance and his key staff are back in Pearl Harbor drawing up plans for the next invasion. So when Halsey's done, they already have a plan of attack and where these vessels are going to be utilized.
yeah, and you have men learning under two great admirals who are different. They are quite different. Both, I don't think either is not aggressive, mind you, in an operational sense, but I think it really benefited the United States Navy overall to learn under these two guys. It's a very dynamic system, very impressive. Japanese could have learned from that one.
Um, I would say one thing among like three overall commanders who had tactical command of the carrier forces, right? So I think from the US, I'm just going to compare Admiral Fletcher, Spruance, and Admiral Halsey.
Hmm.
Fletcher, very, very conservative
Yeah.
and pretty much a proper counterpart to Nagumo
Yeah.
in all sense of personality. Admiral Halsey is aggressive and a fighter.
Yeah.
And that was needed, as we saw in the way he transformed the Guadalcanal campaign, but could get too aggressive. And, he did fall for a bait that
Yeah, he was
nearly
reckless.
proved
Yeah.
disastrous.
He's always
And
been
that nearly
considered
proved.
like a bruiser boxer type. Yeah.
Yeah. And I know both the Army and Navy weren't kind of pleased with his actions in late eight for that,
Hmm.
understandably so. And but again, it served the purpose. And Halsey was also known to keep a very tight leash on all of his subordinate commanders.
Yes.
Even though he still will rush for the battle, they still have to kind of go his way. Spruance, I think, got is definitely an aggressive commander, but is can be refrained. For example, we see that at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, where he and Mark Mitscher inflict a crushing defeat on the Japanese naval aviation, but the bulk of the carrier fleet of Japan escapes. Why? And Spruance gets criticized for not failing to pursue, but
Hmm. Yeah.
his job literally was right now to support the landings of Saipan.
Yeah.
He has his mission already. He had the right. I would say it's like the proper mixture of what you need between aggression and caution. And
Yes.
he was known to give his commanders the operational freedom to act within the overall directive. And at least I value that way more than keeping people on a tight leash. But again, that is probably a very subjective decision because it depends on the personalities of your commanders.
Definitely. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, a large reason why they were so successful was he did the not aggressive thing by taking up a defensive stance and letting the Japanese throw themselves onto him. And he knew the capabilities of their aviators. He knew that they had done so much damage to the Japanese at this point that a lot of those aviators were more green. And well, they shot down 600 enemy aircraft or so, and it was known as the Marianas Turkey Shoot for a good reason. So he had basically knocked out Japan's entire aviation generation with that battle alone. Like it's insane.
And
And
I'll just say this, when he commanded the forces, the US Navy at Okinawa, just seeing the size of the fleet he had,
yeah.
how he was the most powerful man on the planet at that time. If you really look at it.
Definitely was. And as you were saying about being a great delegator, he's one of the best. He said of himself that he was a great judge of men. And I actually have a quote.
Exactly.
When I look at myself objectively, I think that what success I may have achieved through my life is largely due to the fact that I am a good judge of men. I am lazy, and I never have done things myself that I could get someone else to do for me. I can thank heredity for sound constitution and myself for taking care of that constitution. So he even acknowledges that he relies on others and he has a very, basically, you could say he was a very good manager in a lot of ways. So he
But
understood and could judge men.
but the results speak for
Speak for
itself. You
themselves.
don't.
Yeah,
And if you have a good team, you get the job done.
exactly.
And I think as we discuss one of our other admirals in a few moments, we'll see this come into limelight. But I
And
think this is definitely why he's one of the best admirals the United States has ever seen.
he definitely is. And of course, like most of the American admirals, he oversaw just a wide range of impressive battles. You got Midway, the Battle of Tarawa, Marshall Islands, Saipan, Tiananmen, Philippine Sea, the Okinawan campaign, Iwo Jima.
Iwo
Uh,
Jima, yeah.
it's simply incredible. He really, like you said, he was the most powerful man at one point in the entire world because he wielded the goddamn biggest fleet that had ever been seen. And the last thing I would say about him is he was super funny with the way that he would have to walk like 8 to 10 miles a day. So he would just like walk on the aircraft carrier, and people who if they wanted
Or
to talk to him had to walk with him. So he kind of made everyone more physically fit.
but that's actually good, right?
Yeah.
Keeping everyone fit.
So I'll say that that little tidbit of information, that kookiness about him, he was kind of a radical hiking guy for some reason, and
Uh,
yeah, it worked, I guess.
and one thing I'll just add, he even said that during meetings he will be looking quite deeply at thought, and everyone's thinking that he is making great plans and assessments of the situation. And a lot of times he said, "Nope, my mind is just empty at the moment."
Yeah. And I don't know, did you want to add more for your honorable mentions? Because you kind of like said some during this.
Uh, yeah, I think I'll just take a little bit of time. So first, I really want to talk about is one moment. Just give me a moment. I have to just switch around the tabs.
Yes,
Just,
people, as we
just take.
said, we are using Google Chrome to show you pictures of these admirals.
Yeah, no, unfortunately, that share bar was over. So unfortunately, that kind of. So there are kind of three guys. I'll try to go through them very
Here we go.
quickly.
Oh, another thing to the
Uh,
audience. This is another reason for you to watch this on the YouTube channel it'll be on. I can't confirm that 100% yet, but pretty soon I can say what it is.
um, so first, as we can see, we have a picture of Admiral Mark Mitscher,
Hmm.
the pioneer and the best naval aviation admiral that the United States had in World War II.
Definitely.
So this guy, first of all, he commanded air souls. He commanded the Cactus Air Force. in the Guadalcanal and New Britain, New Guinea campaigns. But I think the first rise to fame we see of Admiral Mitscher is definitely the Philippine Sea.
Yeah.
And he is a very aggressive commander. So I think, sorry, before this battle was actually the uh, Operation Hailstone, I would call, was his real masterpiece,
Yeah.
where Spruance's Fifth Fleet just completely destroyed Truk as an installation.
Oh,
Nearly
yes,
caused
he
a
did.
bit of friction between him and so first of all, Mitscher was also a task force commander in Midway. Then he kind of gets like ground commands, right? Now this guy understands naval aviation. I would even put him like he's kind of like almost like if we have Fletcher to Nagumo, we have Mitscher to Admiral Ozawa. You know, the pioneers and guys who know to operate multiple flight decks. Very aggressive commander, but also very sound in the way he planned and executes his operations. For example, in Operation Hailstone, when they attacked Truk, not and he's a pioneer as well, like using radar-equipped Hornets from Enterprise at a night attack. Where during Operation Hailstone, the fuel tanks that amounted to a lot of reserves for the Japanese Navy, they were one of the last targets he attacked on the second day just so that they would not explode and there would be like, a ton of smoke which would affect the performance of his pilots. That's actually pretty sound, detailed strategy. Now, at the Philippine Sea, he launches an aggressive defense of the against the Japanese naval aviation and the land-based aircraft from Saipan, which obviously, as we call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. I think there were several US fighters who became ace in a day, actually, with 5 kills confirmed. And he launches a kind of aggressive pursuit for a bit against the Japanese Navy. And in that pursuit, they do manage to catch a couple of carriers and around 5 transports and a cruiser, which are sunk. So they've dealt a pretty big blow to the Japanese Navy, but not the crippling blow as some on Washington may have expected. And this guy also is quite a risk taker, I will also say. When the aircraft from his raid against the Philippine Sea were returning, he makes a very bold decision in enemy waters to order all carriers and ships to eliminate themselves so that the pilots know where they have to land. Now, just imagine in the pitch black of the ocean at night, you see these lights, you know it's a juicy target if you're a Japanese submarine. So it's huge risk and he takes it. Then during Leyte Gulf, where he's now under Halsey's command, not control, my bad. He helped in the sinking of the Musashi, and the he and Halsey kind of fall bait and get lured up north as well. But overall, he does retain the command of the US Air Arm, and it is quite interesting. What I really like about him was, first of all, he's a man of few words, and in terms of frame and everything, he's not really a big, imposing figure. And if he's not happy or wants someone to explain themselves, a raised eyebrow towards that particular person is all he needed to give. And he seemed to be quite a fair guy. Like, he'll expect the best, but he will give the support. But I think the one arm that really loved him was definitely the naval aviation because he would really listen to the squadron commanders, the wing commanders of these naval air groups, talk to them and try to implement their suggestions and practices into the US Navy, which no doubt influenced and improved carrier operations as we would see later on the war. So definitely one of the most underrated admirals of the United States. The other I want to put is Admiral Turner. And the reason is he is the guy that executed a lot of successful landing operations in the Pacific. So he landed at Guadalcanal. He commanded the New Britain, New Georgia campaigns, the entire Central Pacific drive, so Saipan, the Marianas, Marshall Islands, Gilbert Islands, Iwo Jima. This is the guy who did it. And I think he was a very complicated personality, to say the least, because this guy was arguably one of the best planners in the war. So when even when the scale of his operations gone up, right, where he has hundreds of amphibious assault craft and the landing tractors, everything, uh, LCIs, LSTs, destroyers, cruisers, whatever. He will, by minute, actually try to detail down in the plan where each vessel is going to be and where they are going to be firing. That is the level of granularity this guy's put in his planning. It's immaculate. But unfortunately, one of his biggest issues was his temper. And it was said that, he could get into conflicts with his command, senior officers and subordinates almost as much. One of the great examples I can think of right now is the Guadalcanal campaign. With the absence of Admiral Gormley, both Turner and Admiral Fletcher had really contrasting views, to say the least, about how they have to implement Nimitz's directives for the operation. And that actually did lead to the fiasco, which would be the Battle of Savo Island. But if you were to talk about the scale of operations he could command, at Guadalcanal, he only had to coordinate 51 vessels. At the Battle of Okinawa, 1,213 vessels. And if you actually had the invasion of Japan and Kyushu that was, on the cards, he would have commanded almost 3,000 vessels. And knowing his personality, he would have planned it down to the detail. But it was, like, as a future Marine General, Robert E. Hogeboom said, he said, the greatness of Admiral Turner is that he worked his plans out in minute detail himself, right down to the last position of every amphibious vessel, where they would be, when they should be there, what they were going to do. I knew him personally, and I know that he was a fighting man. He was tough. He was not always fair, but he insisted on his people doing what they were supposed to do. I guess sometimes you just need these guys who will just get the job done no matter what. So, Craig, do you have anything to add for these two admirals before we move?
I think just to say a bit more about Admiral Turner, he was the mastermind behind amphibious warfare for the Americans in the Pacific. It goes without saying, he not only planned out everything, he was in many ways the guy who championed the use of like LCVPs and LSTs. If it wasn't for
Yeah,
him, a lot of things would not have been innovated. He was the guy that learnt from certain amphibious assaults, innovated, integrated what he could, championed what he thought was best, and he was known to have a great attention to detail, and it just shows.
yeah,
He advanced amphibious warfare to the max, and as many people have pointed out to this day, since the Pacific War, no nation on Earth has ever done this kind of logistical feat. So the United States still retains like that experience. If a war were to break out today, like they're the only ones who actually know what happens.
yeah. And it's actually quite a surprise that the guy continued with his career because he was one of the two key admirals implicated for the lack of preparedness for Pearl Harbor,
Yeah, yeah, that's
along
true.
with Admiral Kimball.
Yeah,
He managed to survive because he did have a thing of, at that time, interfering with the intelligence, it seems, but ultimately he was cleared out and he played his role in a really big way with
hmm.
the invasion of the Central Pacific campaign. So,
All right.
yeah,
And we're going to be moving on to the worst, I believe.
yes. And that, I know it's kind of hard, but let's start with Admiral Gormley.
Well, I
So
actually was going to say that both admirals could be put on equal footing for the worst. When we talk
I'm
about,
just choosing who to start with. It's nothing about a ranking.
yeah, but
Just yeah.
Gormley, and I would make it very quick. He's an easy target because he really had an inability to adapt to situations. He was extremely slow to react. He was a very indecisive admiral. He didn't provide adequate air support during the initial Guadalcanal campaign, which that's a big reason why he would kind of lose his command. He could not coordinate with Vandegrift because he locked himself in his room with his
And
paperwork.
he never was there to show himself to the troops. One
Yeah,
of Nimitz's directives for the commander of the South Pacific forces was, guys, show yourself. Let the troops know you're there. You don't even have to go to the front lines. You just have to like maybe go closer to New Guinea and just show. He would never do that. And I think one of his biggest failings was he could not keep his sub commanders within control or check or step in when there's an argument, because that's what you need to do as an overall lead, right?
yeah,
For example, there was the issues on how about its calculated risk, right? That is what one of the principal directives Nimitz had was you don't have to get expose yourself unnecessary to risk, but if you think you can deal out a bigger punishment, you go for it. Now, with him away, you had a very conservative admiral in Admiral Fletcher, who commanded the carrier task forces and wanted to withdraw right away from the Guadalcanal and Solomon's area. And Admiral Turner, who at least wanted to stay till all supplies were properly unloaded. And they could not agree because without the Gormley, who was their overall commander, able to take charge and establish one line of decision, both just did their own thing. And Gormley was probably the most pessimistic commander I could think of in World War II amongst all armed services and factions. I do not know anyone who was as pessimistic and I don't know. It's kind of like a mix of both the pessimism and the lack of initiative, because we know there are others we've talked about that had that lack of initiative, but they do not have that much of a defeatist, pessimistic attitude of how the situation is going to go out. Because all Gormley kept crying about was, I need reinforcements, I need reinforcements. And the there was a lethargy in the way the US were conducting the war in his theater of operations when he's finally replaced by Admiral Halsey, who was sent by Nimitz to inspect the region, where he said, Gormley and his staff could not answer any questions that any command staff needs to be prepared with. Halsey takes over, and that's it. You
yeah.
see a complete 180 in the mood of and operational scale and performance of all US forces in the region. He's literally just throwing everything he's got. He's aggressive. He's trying to push in reinforcements. He's trying to get operations to get in supplies. Otherwise, Vandegrift and his Marines were really struggling for a lot of time, especially when the Japanese early in the war were getting in heavy bombardments on their base at Henderson Field.
Yeah.
So, and this is pretty much Gormley's only real command of the war, because after this, he was dismissed and kind of just, I think, just because of his deep friendship he had with Roosevelt, he was first made commander of the 14th Naval District, and then, had pretty much administrative roles at best. They just could not obviously sack him, but he was immediately removed from command.
Yeah, so Gormley was absent in all the early planning phases, particularly during the Guadalcanal campaign and the subsequent invasions. And he was basically he set up his HQ in Nomea, about 900 miles away. He became completely overwhelmed by the quick developments and the overall operation. You know, the lack of immediate resources, all the paperwork, myriad of details he had to overlook, and he had even political little squabbles with the
The new
French
main government.
government, yeah, New
Oh yeah,
Caledonia and
forgot
stuff.
about that.
And that he just literally like I was making a bit of a joke out of it, but it's true. He would lock himself in his room and he would just kind of be looking through his paperwork, and he never showed his face. He was seen as weak, indecisive, didn't communicate with the other commanders, didn't get along with most of the commanders. And yeah, it's probably easy to say I think if you had to argue between him and Fletcher, he's probably the worst. But Fletcher will have his own faults too. And yeah, that's
Yeah.
pretty much Gormley in a nutshell.
Yeah, and the other admiral is at the time where before his dismissal, he was probably the best regarded admiral of the U.S. Navy, at least
Mhm.
probably with public opinion. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, and I find it a really sad fall for grace for him. So Fletcher is what the US would call the black shoe admiral. So he was a guy that grew up on the big capital ships in his service. And at the start of the war, he was a rear admiral commanding Cruiser Division 6 at Pearl Harbor. And Admiral Kimmel, at that time, who was commander of the Pacific forces, had put, uh, you know, Fletcher down as a possible successor for the entire Pacific fleet. According to Admiral Kincaid, Fletcher was scheduled to be commander of cruisers scouting force, and Kimmel kind of postponed this, where he led an operation to Wake Island. And Fletcher really only plays a key role in the war for 1 year. That is the year of 1942. So he's first given Task Force 14, so sorry, 17, which is around the Yorktown, and he engages with Nagumo at the Battle of the Coral Sea, which is the first beyond visual range fleet versus fleet engagement. So tactically, it's kind of like, both sides do not really claim victory, but I would kind of give it to the Japanese just because they continue to land their troops at New Guinea. And Fletcher's forces do take a beating because he does lose the Lexington. And the Yorktown is quite horribly damaged, to say the least. I think they take 2 weeks to stow it back to Pearl Harbor. It's that badly damaged. And after the battle, we have Midway, where Craig, as you said, he is given the overall command of the operation because at this point, he still is the only active admiral in the US with some real practical experience of coordinating multiple carriers and leading carrier forces. No one else is there. And he was given Task Force 17 and Task Force 16, which, as I said, was given to Admiral Spruance, who was another black shoe admiral because it is initially supposed to go to Halsey, but he was quite sick at the time and was not fit for command. And Halsey himself had recommended Spruance. And you have the big battle, which did not stop the Japanese, but definitely blunted their attacking prowess of the Imperial Japanese Navy. And unfortunately, Fletcher's ship, Yorktown, despite the amazing efforts of the US repair staff, is lost in the battle. But hey, you lose one carrier but have destroyed four. I'll take that any day of the week, especially considering it was your carrier that's already pretty banged up, to say the least. Now, now Vice Admiral Fletcher, he's put in command of the carrier forces for the Guadalcanal landings. And as I said earlier, with the um, situation with Gormley, with Gormley absent, he and Turner clashed. And Fletcher believed that the operation is not at all planned well, and his carriers are going to be too exposed. Even though they're going to be operating at pretty much what I would consider the extreme ranges of Japanese aircraft, he still was scared to put the carriers in that position. And despite a 10-day request, he withdrew his air cover within 72 hours. And no one really stopped him. And the Japanese, noting that, we have the Battle of Savo Island, which we know is the United States Navy's biggest surface defeat of the war. And because of the lack of covering forces, Turner has to withdraw his forces much earlier than planned. And we see the Marines put in a really desperate struggle as well. And then you do have the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, where he and Nagumo again face off for the third time in their careers. And I don't know how you really want to position it, because it was just a draw, to be honest. The US did lose uh, a carrier in the battle, which was heavily damaged, which was the Enterprise. The Japanese had one light carrier, one destroyer, and a transport sunk, and they took more material losses. But the strategic initiative at that point was still more in Japan's favor, and they were able to continue with their operations. The US had to limp back their navy, and um, this was pretty much the nail in his coffin. So Admiral King, the ultimate boss of the United States Navy, was really livid. Now, given that guy was a very aggressive personality, and Fletcher was relieved of command, and then later would be sent to the Alaskan theaters. But by then, the Aleutian campaign in Alaska and everything, they were pretty much on the path to complete victory by the time he took operational command. And he pretty much just stayed there for the entire war. So yeah, June 1942, top of the world for the United States Navy. By September, he's being pushed off to the side. But very cautious guy. If you just see the way that Halsey would position the carriers for sweeps and recons in the Solomons campaign when he took over, the carriers would be hundreds of miles north than where Fletcher would have liked them to be. But it did mean that the carriers were there to provide support. They were able to add their aircraft for reconnaissance. And if you see the enemy, you know how to hurt them. And I think this is where Fletcher, with his very timid command style, I don't think he would have cut it. So that's where he really is pushed amongst the worst ranked US admirals of note.
All right, so I guess we're gonna randomize and do the next faction.
Yep. So we just have two more, and well, we'll start off with the Royal Navy. So just give me one moment. So Craig, do you mind
Yep,
if you could
I'm.
take over the sharing now? So we are having the Royal Navy, and I think what is really um, good is the Royal Navy. We don't have to worry about the Pacific, and we first. I'm going to be starting with Admiral Brown Cunningham, ABC as he was popularly called, who would later be the chief of the naval staff for the British Navy. Now, ABC was the commander of the Mediterranean fleet during the Second World War, and he was one of the greatest things that I find about his rise to an admiralship was he never served heavily in the battleships. He was predominantly a crew destroyer commander. He did for a bit serve with uh, the battleships, but he never really found it good. So I think when he said that when he had HMS Hood as his flagship, he said that the quarters for the admiral is almost palatial compared to what he would have on a destroyer.
I'll just add great uncles on that ship.
Oh, congrats, I guess.
Yeah, he died on
But
it, but yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry. But so he was made, I think 1939 kind of was the lucky year for him when Dudley Pound took over as the first Sea Lord. That is, I think the best equivalent is the Chief of Naval Operations, equivalent for the United States in the Royal Navy. And as Pound was the previous commander of the Mediterranean Fleet, and a lot of senior naval commanders before this were in really poor health, it allowed Admiral Cunningham to, um, uh, rise to the rank that he took command of the fleet. All right, and now first he has his tryst with actually the French Navy, and this is where we have the attack on Mirza al-Kabir. But it does show his ruthlessness in the way he sanctioned the attack when the French were not willing to parley. And one thing I really like about him is Admiral Cunningham is a very aggressive but pragmatic commander. His raids on the Italians in the build-up to the Operation Compass, it really hampered the Italian supply lines. And unlike Admiral Yamamoto, he did carry out the first ever uh, attack on a fleet in by naval era, which was the raid on Taranto, which really crippled the Italian Navy. Now,
I'll
over the
just
course
add
of
to the
the
audience. I apologize. I had put up the wrong Cunningham. The right Cunningham is
yeah,
up now.
yeah. So from the latter part of 1940 to early 1941, he's having pretty much a field day with the Italian navies, given that even though on paper the Italian Navy is quite powerful, he has the better crew. And unfortunately, he then has his hands full when the Germans decide to come and start using their U-boats to pretty decent effect, and the Luftwaffe to bomb and attack his forces. So, with his forces at Malta, where he used to operate submarines and torpedo boats, and Alexandria, he does take, the British take an overall beating, but he's able to still utilize his forces to interdict supplies very aggressively. And by 1943, he is promoted to an admiral of the fleet and does help in the planning and launch of Operation Torch as well, which, considering you're landing three armies of about 35 to 40,000 men each on three different countries and areas, he does a really good job. And this is one quote where you could see that, he's still pretty aggressive, is just before the Axis surrender North Africa, he orders no Axis soldiers should be allowed to escape. He just says, "Sink, burn, and destroy. Let nothing pass." So you really got to see that this guy is the real deal. Like he's the proper, I would just say a bit more temperamental version of Admiral King. So October 1943, he gets a promotion to the Chief of the Naval Staff with the death of Admiral Dudley Pound, who had been suffering from cancer for quite a while. And he helps in the logistics and planning for Operation Overlord. So he will be working with several key commanders of the Allied forces. And he also and before that, he also attends all the major conferences. So the Potsdam, Cairo, Tehran, Yalta conferences. So he is instrumental in helping with the allocation of resources on the naval theater, including the decision that we would see uh, where the British fleet would be deploying to Japan after victory in Europe. And he also rubbed shoulders with Montgomery. Surprise, surprise. When Montgomery kind of delayed an advance into clearing out the approach to Antwerp, which really compromised the Allied positions just because Montgomery did not want to do it then. But overall, he was the first non-battleship commanding admiral of the fleet for the Britain, but definitely the right man for the job, and definitely deserves his top spot the way he handled the entire naval theater against both the Luftwaffe and the Kriegsmarine, Regia Aeronautica, and Regia Marina. So that is Admiral Cunningham. I think there is one, two honorable mentions I want to put for the the Royal Navy. So one is Admiral Bertram Ramsey. One of his biggest fames is he is the guy who executed Operation Dynamo. That is the Dunkirk evacuations. And the crazy thing is, he was actually retired when Churchill called him up to take over and help with Operation Dynamo. And the reason Churchill did is this guy is very calm and analytical. He can stay calm under pressure. And with Dunkirk, I think you definitely needed that. He was the one who put, all the convoys, requisitioning the civilian boats. And he chose the longer route amongst the three routes between Dunkirk and Britain. But that also offered the safest chances for his vessels to come through. And given ultimately that a good chunk of the BEF was successfully withdrawn, because he and Churchill were expecting 45,000 men at the best to be evacuated, and they got there 350,000. So that is definitely where his fame rises. Then he has like defensive roles, um, in defending Dover. But then he gets involved with Operation Torch and Husky in terms of organizing the ships as one of the supporting commanders and executing the landing. So for example, at Operation Husky, he was given charge of the entire eastern landing portion. So if I'm not mistaken, that would have been Montgomery's Eighth Army that was being disembarked in that theater. Operation Neptune is he was the naval commander in chief of the entire Allied forces of Operation Overlord. And to keep in mind that this is an invasion fleet, if you include all the warships, transport, supply ships, Mulberry Harbors, submarines, everything, this guy is commanding 7,000 vessels. And not only has to deliver 160,000 men on the first day, he has to ensure that the supplies are coming, the Mulberry Harbors are set up, Pluto is working, which is the fuel pipeline that the Allies had created to get fuel across from Britain to France for the armored divisions. He also had to contend with the threat of the U-boats. And he actually created like this one of these very aggressive task groups which were at the border between like where the channel starts, and they were aggressively hunting down the U-boats proactively, that the U-boats were not at all able to cause any damage or worry for the landings on D-Day. And in this, he again performed a magnificent job, because by the end of June, he's landed almost 1 million soldiers onto the European mainland with supplies. And he also is quite a shrewd political diffuser, I think, for the lack of a better term, because he did have a situation that he had to deal with on HMS Belfast. So for the D-Day landings, both King George VI and Churchill wanted to be there to witness the landings. The problem is the king did not want the prime minister there. The prime minister did not want the king there. And now, quite difficult to tell one of the top two guys of your country to take a jump. He managed to handle the situation quite well. And, they were at loggerheads, and he just says, I'm not going to take any responsibility for the two of you. HMS Belfast is scheduled for fire support bomb duties. It is going to be involved in shelling the German position. So it is at risk of being attacked back. And if something were to happen badly in this operation, we need the political leaders to be available to, in terms of, you and the king, to both be available and safe in Britain to take the decision should the worst happen. He gets the situation resolved as both do not bother him for that. So you got to give him credits for that. And he again is, along with Admiral Cunningham, kind of like, pissed off Montgomery when they asked him to clear the approach the into Antwerp, which was the port that the Allies needed to alleviate their logistics. And it was a huge, huge, huge missed opportunity because the ultimate battle that took place, the Battle of Scheldt, when Montgomery launched it, the German 15th Army had completed its escape from France and had taken up defensive positions. If he had launched it when the Navy requested, they were just starting their retreat. So you can imagine how many more, what a missed opportunity it was. But then again, Montgomery is Montgomery. That's all we need to say. And sadly for Bertram Ramsey, he does not survive to the end of the war. On 2nd January 1945, he was flying down to meet Montgomery, and he crashed near the airport southwest of Paris and was killed there. So posthumously, you know, he was given awards and everything, but he is like the coolest admiral in terms of composure that was there. The last admiral of honorable mention is Admiral Max Horton. He was the commander of Western Approaches. So Western Approaches, for the audience, is based in Liverpool and Londonderry, which coordinated the supply movements of the Allies between the United Kingdom and North America. And Max Horton took over this post in 1942 from Sir Percy Noble. And these two guys, Horton and Noble, are really responsible for winning the Battle of the Atlantic more than anyone else. Horton, not only did he utilize the expanded resources quite well with the new destroyers, flower class corvettes, and the new frigates coming in, he was instrumental in giving support for Coastal Command to get more aircraft operation and flying the Atlantic. So that helped close the mid-Atlantic gap, which was this sea gap that the German U-boats would operate freely in. He also created the use of the rescue ships with convoys. So these are just empty freighters with extra living spaces. So any freighter that was torpedoed by the German U-boats, the rest of the convoy could go through. These ships, which would be sailing, would then pick up the survivors, and the Germans generally do not target them because it's not of much strategic value. So at least the convoy is not going to be suffering speed. Anyways, these convoys move very slowly. So this obviously helped improve the survival rate of convoys. And he created these support groups. These were escorts that were not allocated to any convoy, but would just actually be actively hunting the U-boats, or if needed, can be requested to come and support if there's a big U-boat battle. And the convoy escort that is allocated to them is being overwhelmed. And this actually allowed them, and he used Iceland as his base for this. So he kept rotating these convoy groups out. And by the middle of 1943, it's known that the Battle of the Atlantic was a completely lost cause, that even Donitz would just say, just being in the Atlantic, you won the war for us, because the British were in complete ascendancy by now. And no thanks to, and no, in no small part thanks to Admiral Max Horton. So Craig, do you have anything you'd like to add before we get to our worst?
No, honestly, I think we should probably get on to the worst.
Yeah. So the worst British admiral I'm gonna put is quite a senior character, Admiral Sir Dudley Pound, who at the onset of war was the first Lord of the Sea. So he is the top dog of the British Navy at the time. Now he's a true and tested battleship admiral in his career, the naval war, because in the Battle of Jutland, he contributed to as a battleship commander at Jutland. So you can imagine how senior this guy's career has been. So his career actually started in 1891, I might add. So at Jutland, he was a battleship commander.
Man, God, that's a long career. Holy crap.
Yeah, but in that he sunk a German cruiser. So unfortunately, he's never really been a guy that really took to the newer technologies that well. And despite his failing health, which was, you know, a big problem, even in 1939, he was promoted to the top job solely because the other senior admirals or people who could take over, they were in even worse condition health-wise. Now, here is where I just really find that he really loses his charm of being a great admiral. So he's first of all backed by Churchill intensely. Probably because he's kind of like a plain, boring guy who doesn't really, question Churchill. And this obviously works great for Churchill. And a lot of the other senior admirals, like Charles Forbes and John Tovies, who at various points commanded the British Home Fleet under him, under Pound, they clash with terms of operational doctrine and how they should utilize his forces. And I think one great example actually was with John Tovey, where after the sinking of the Bismarck, sorry, the Bismarck actions, he actually Pound wanted to court-martial the captain of the Prince of Wales battleship and Admiral Frederick Walker, who commanded the cruisers Norfolk and Suffolk, for apparently not failing to do enough. That's it. There was no real reason, and Admiral John Tovey stood up for those guys accused because he said these guys have done enough. The ships are damaged. They were out of fuel. Even though you guys said, we'll tow the King George V to encounter the Bismarck, that's not really going to do anything. And initially, when Pound did not relent, Admiral Tovey actually threatened his resignation, something like he pulled a Yamamoto on him. And he said, I will come and defend these guys in the court martial as a friend then. So you can see, like, Dudley Pound is that kind of guy that if they don't do it his way, he doesn't really like you. While he does get the credit for the Battle of the Atlantic's, change of tide, I never would attribute it to him. I think that really goes to Western Approach's command more than anything. So in that sense, Percy Noble and Admiral Max Horton. And I think one of his biggest failures where, again, he uh, had a clash with Tovey was the supplies to Russia. So Churchill had said, for example, if any country joins the war, regardless of the past, any country joins the war against Germany, regardless of our past grievances, we will support you wholeheartedly. So that was the Soviet Union. And you had the Arctic convoys that were going through. Pound and Churchill were big proponents of sending in the convoys at any time of day, any time of the year, which, given the position of the Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine in Norway, was a huge risk, especially in the extended hours of daylight in the summer. And that was actually something John Tovey himself also objected to. He said we have to limit the convoys right now to the winter months when we have more darkness to get away. And the biggest disaster for what I would call Dudley Pound's career, which really tarnished his reputation, was the Battle of Convoy PQ-17, as I'll call it. It was a massive convoy with over 240,000 tons worth of supplies for the Soviet Union. So it's not only including ammo and food, it's also including quite a lot of trucks and guns. And Admiral Pound, he gives some really bad intel and orders because he gets some intel that the Tirpitz battleship of Germany has weighed anchor and is sailing to engage the convoy. Now, keep in mind, convoy PQ-17 is escorted by, just like 11 escort vessels and 6 destroyers, and it has uh, 2 battleships, 6 cruisers, and an aircraft carrier, and 13 other destroyers as a covering force. But they're quite far away. Moment he just hears that the Tirpitz is coming through, right? It's weighing anchor. He orders the covering force to disengage and return, and the escorts to scatter. Which meant that on his orders, the merchant ships are completely exposed to the Luftwaffe and U-boats. And what we see is 24 of the 35 merchant ships and over 60% of the supplies lost. That's huge margin. And the funny thing was, while Tirpitz was actually weighing anchor, it was actually just moving fjords within Norway. The Tirpitz did not even know about the convoy.
Yeah, of course, because the Tirpitz was just moving to another location to hide, like it did the entire
Pretty much.
war.
Yeah. But if you really look at it, if the material losses is why this convoy was so much of a disaster, because over 430 light tanks, 210 aircraft, and almost 3,000 other vehicles were lost in those merchant ships. And 153 merchant, like beyond the ship losses of the merchant ships as well, you also lost 153 merchantmen killed. And do you know what is the German losses for the battle? It was only from the Luftwaffe.
Less than
They
10
lost
aircraft.
five aircraft.
5.
That's it.
That's atrocious.
Yeah. So this definitely, and really tarnished him. And then he was also blamed for the lack of preparation for the Channel Dash operation, which was how the Gneisenau and Scharnhorst just kind of slipped through England's front door from Brest to Germany. And Dudley Pound was very lethargic in ordering the defense of the southern English forces. Anyways, by towards the end of 1943, he is starting to have serious health complications, and he formally resigns in September, where I think everyone realizes his ability to lead and command has completely gone, and he would be dying a month later at the age of 66.
That's a
So,
really shitty way to go down.
true
Yeah.
enough, it was, but he did have a lot of faults and was, in my view, attributed to successes that were not necessarily his or his alone. So that brings us to the end of the Royal Navy. And I think we can go to our final
Final faction.
faction. Yep. And that's the Kriegsmarine.
You want to do best or worst first?
Let's go with the worst, because I think we can spend a little bit of time for the best. So, given the Kriegsmarine was never really a big arm of the Nazi armed forces, it's no surprise that I'm putting Eric Raeder, the first commander-in-chief of the Kriegsmarine during World War II, as the worst admiral. And it's honestly due to doctrinal decisions that he made and his inability to really back up or believe Donitz, which could have stifled a lot of initiative from the early parts of the war. So Raeder is still the guy with the surface action. So he, like Hitler, loves the idea of having these new powerful pocket battleships, your new heavy cruisers like the Gneisenau, the Scharnhorst, or their favorite, the Bismarck and the Tirpitz.
As I
You
would
know,
call them, wastes of money.
true. And ultimately, they lacked everything that they needed to go up against the Royal Navy. So, for example, even in the Norwegian campaign, the Kriegsmarine takes such heavy losses to the Royal Navy that if Operation Sea Lion went ahead as planned in September, the Kriegsmarine had only a cruiser and I think two or three destroyers as operational in summer of 1940. And you want to cross the invasion, you want to cross the channel with that, covering your forces.
He doesn't have to worry. Goring would provide everything that they needed. Just fly the guys in. That would go great, you know.
So he did, like, obviously protest against Sea Lion just for that. Thank God he had the sense for that. And while he did and where he also failed was July 1940 after the Battle of France. They still want to go ahead with Plan Z. So for the audience, Plan Z was this great, ambitious building project by the by Hitler and Raeder for expanding the Kriegsmarine. And honestly, it is just fanciful thinking with absolutely no chance of ever being completed. Because just listen to this. They wanted 13 battleships and battle cruisers, 4 aircraft carriers, around 15 Panzerslips, which I guess were the pocket battleships
Yeah.
equivalents, uh, 5 heavy cruisers, 13 light cruisers, 22 scout cruisers, 90 torpedo boats, 68 destroyers. Oh, great. Sounds great. But hey, Britain is also going to be rebuilding if it was still at peace.
It's funny
And
they didn't learn
they,
anything from World War One. Like
yeah, they still actually did believe, even except for Donitz, no one in the senior Nazi and Wehrmacht Luftwaffe high commands really believed that Britain was finished at that time. They thought it was because of the army's disaster. Donitz knew he could start Britain up, but all these resources going to Plan Z from the limited amount being allocated to the Luftwaffe, that's really bad. So ultimately, with Radar, we see that resources never go, and he kind of does whatever he can to really shut down Donitz from getting the resources he wants or trying to get it. And initially, Hitler's also like not in favor of U-boats because there's nothing big and glamorous of smashing a inauguration champagne bottle on a U-boat when you could do it on the Bismarck, right?
yeah, because who cares about results, right? Gotta look good.
Yeah, I mean, I get it, as quoting the Rossellini Tempesta from Burnout, winning isn't everything. Looking good while winning is essential. Though, in fairness, one of his good um great things that he planned was the Channel Dash, which was a very successful operation that he planned out and kind of really humiliated the British. But he, along with Field Marshal Keitel and Goring, were the guys who insisted on declaring war on the United States right away after Pearl Harbor.
Yep.
Like, guys, you're barely beating the Royal Navy, and now you just want to add another powerful navy to your list of enemies, right?
Yeah.
What could possibly go wrong? And yes, so unfortunately, there you have that. And then, with the way the war is going, Hitler's deteriorating mental capacity to function and multiple results going against him, he's forced to resign in 1943. So, yeah, he kind of does nothing for the rest of the war. And, he's put on trial, found guilty, sentenced to life imprisonment. But he is released in 1955 and dies of natural causes in 1960. because yeah, ultimately, they just he did not have as many of the bad traits attributed. But overall, the doctrine of approach, even when the results are showing otherwise, and his stubbornness to adapt to it, is why I put him as the worst of the German admirals, which leads us to Karl Donitz as the best admiral. Surprise, surprise.
Yeah, there's kind of no one
Now,
else to pick here.
and first of all, Donitz was probably the most pragmatic of the German commanders, realizing that in a war with Britain, it's the supplies that's going to win the war, nothing else. But unfortunately, at the start of the Second World War, his U-boat arm was, I think, 50 ships, and only 27 could reach the Atlantic from their bases in Germany at the start of war. And a third of it is operational because Donitz knew the rule of third. So Donitz, that's why you heard this famous thing of Donitz arguing for the 300 U-boat arm. Because what it means is there will be one third of the U-boats that are actually just going to and from the battleground and their home ports, one third getting refit and retrained and rested, and one third in the actual combat zone. So if he needs to keep 100 U-boats out at sea, which he felt was enough, he could win the war for Britain because he calculated they needed to sink around 600,000 tons of supplies a month, and then that would start bringing Britain to its knees.
600,000 tons a month. That is incredible number. Wow.
For yeah, and unfortunately for him, the biggest problem was he never had the Kriegsmarine was small, and a lot of the U-boat tonnage sunk is actually disproportionate early in the war and only to the great U-boat aces like Otto Kretschmer and everything. But Donitz, who's now being blocked by his boss and Eric Rader and trying to get more U-boats operational, first actually suffers a setback in when he has to forcefully, on the Führer's orders, support the invasion of Norway, where his submarines do absolutely nothing. And that's due to the magnetic influence being weaker at the like those northern altitudes, really affecting the contact pistols of his torpedoes. So a lot of commanders were so dismayed in the U-boat arm that their torpedoes are actually hitting but not detonating. After the Battle of France, he takes the Channel ports and the western ports of France, like Brest and Saint Nazaire, starts hampering the Allied shipping, and he creates the Wolfpack tactics, which were really effective, especially during the happy time. And Donitz has one trait from Goebbels. He knew the power of propaganda and press. So when his commanders come back from a patrol, he's there and he makes sure that the press are there to photograph, showcase their triumphs, how much they sunk, etc. Because he realized if his boss is actually going to be, stopping him from getting the resources he needs to find a way to get to the Führer. And this actually works, but unfortunately, Raider will still try to persist in delaying resources to Donitz. And, it was, I think his greatest month was probably, one of his best months was, what do you call it? November 1942. 134th Allied ships were sunk, accounting for 800,000 tons. However, he did suffer a defeat because now the Allies had that month was actually an outlier because all the escorts had gone for Operation Torch. So there was a disproportionately fewer number of escorts for the same convoys coming through. So easier for the British. And by by June 1943, even though in the March that they have their best month where they sink almost a similar number of tons, the U-boats are in full retreat from the Atlantic because of multiple innovations and overwhelming resources that the Allies throw against him. That Donitz pretty much knows that it's game set match now. He does have to argue the Führer to keep the surface fleet, but there's really nothing he can ever do again after July 1943. They have absolutely zero impact on D-Day. That in 1944 he would be telling his crews, just being there in the Atlantic, you are showcasing your defiance to the Allies and everything. That's really not what he wanted to. But he was a guy that really was out there to help his men as much as he could. He tried to ensure that he had the best facilities available at the ports, not only to prepare, but for the men to relax. They could at least have a good number of cigarettes and cigars, because that's pretty much the lifeblood, I would call it, for these submariners. And he was the only German commander that suspected that the Enigma had been broken. No one else really did, but while he did suspect it, he actually thought it was due to treachery rather, and not Bletchley Park. Just gotta add that a little bit. And then we see, after um, the retreat of Germany from France, his ships are pretty much useless. And after Hitler's suicide, he is made the leader of the Third Reich, and he's the guy who formally surrenders Germany unconditionally to the Allies. So yeah, I guess that was it for the Kriegsmarine, and we've covered all the admirals that we think were the best or worst for the major factions of World War II.
Yeah, of course we left out, the Italians, and I guess you could make arguments for a few other nations, mind you. I guess you could argue the Soviets, but I wouldn't even want to
Not
dabble into
really,
that.
not really much to really put there, except for like some submariners.
I mean, the Soviet
French,
Navy in World War II was so pathetic. They bought like an old, outdated battleship from like the British for no reason, anyways. Yeah, I'm biased, but in World of Warships, it's like the amount of paper ships they put in that game for the Soviets is so embarrassing. And I know it's because a majority of the players are Russian, but anyways. That definitely covers the main factions of World War II for the admirals. And before we depart, I just want to let everybody know that if you want to further support the channel, please check out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/the Pacific War Channel. By joining either, you get access to the exclusive podcast, you get early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. And next time, we're going to be covering the air commanders of all the factions of World War II. And I think it's going to be pretty interesting because they don't often get talked about. And there's going to be a lot of interesting characters, some reviled and some underrated. We'll say that much. But until then.